Do you believe your state is immune to transformation? Reconsider that thought. What if the forthcoming significant change isn't about politics or the environment, but rather international dynamics? The world stage is constantly shifting, with numerous global events reshaping alliances and economies daily. Today, we delve into a fascinating, perhaps even startling trend. Certain U.S. states are already behaving more like their northern neighbors than their fellow American counterparts. They enjoy Tim Hortons coffee, apologize perhaps a tad too frequently, and might even find themselves cheering for the Maple Leafs. But this phenomenon goes far beyond simple stereotypes. These states have deeply intertwined economies, share extensive borders, and hold values that resonate strongly with Canada. As divisions within the United States appear to widen, the once far-fetched concept of secession or realignment doesn't seem quite so detached from reality anymore. Could your state potentially thrive by joining Canada? We're about to dissect the 10 U.S. states that might just find a more comfortable fit under the Canadian maple leaf. Stay with us as we explore these complex connections, and we'll share our conclusions at the end of this analysis. And if you find this exploration intriguing, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the like button. It genuinely helps us bring more content like this to you. We'd also love to hear where you're watching from, so drop your location in the comments below. Let's begin our journey with Washington State. It receives so much rainfall that residents often quip the sun is merely a legend. Yet beneath the overcast skies and verdant landscapes, an interesting transformation is underway. Washington, renowned as the hub for tech behemoths and a culture obsessed with coffee, is exhibiting a northward inclination in multiple aspects. With annual trade exceeding $22 billion with Canada, and thousands of residents commuting across the border each year for work, leisure, or family, the state's fabric is deeply interwoven with its northern neighbor. This constant exchange fosters a sense of shared identity that sometimes feels more Canadian than American. Geographically, Vancouver is often more accessible than many major U.S. cities for Washingtonians. Culturally, the similarities are striking. They often seem like siblings separated only by an administrative line. But here's the truly compelling part. In recent electoral cycles, over 68% of Washington voters supported policies that closely mirror Canadian-style governance. It's astonishing how frequently their societal values align with those found in provinces such as British Columbia, covering everything from environmental protection to social welfare programs. This alignment raises profound questions about identity and affiliation. What occurs when economic boundaries become indistinct, when cultural distinctions fade, when all that separates two places is a line drawn on a map? Consider this. Would anyone truly register a difference if Washington quietly shifted its allegiance northward? Ask yourself, does this state already feel more Canadian than American? Before we move to the next state on our list, make sure you stay tuned until the very end, as we'll be drawing some important conclusions from this analysis. Next, let's venture south to Oregon. This state is known for its peculiarities, like attendants pumping your gas, a unique Oregonian custom. It's quirky, fiercely independent, and perhaps surprisingly, quietly Canadian in many ways. If you look beyond the surface, you'll discover connections that run deeper than just shared geography. An overwhelming 80% of Oregon's exports are destined for Canada, and this isn't limited to traditional goods like lumber and wine. The exchange includes ideas, lifestyle trends, and even legislative approaches. Oregon was among the first states in the U.S. to legalize physician-assisted dying, a policy that mirrors Canada's own regulations, reflecting a shared perspective on complex ethical issues. The state actively protects its forests, invests significantly in healthcare infrastructure, and champions inclusive social policies, all priorities that resonate strongly with Canadian values. But the connections don't stop there. Canada has already engaged in public forums discussing the possibility of welcoming new territories into its fold. Should a segment of the Pacific Northwest ever consider floating across the border, Oregon, with its established ties and aligned values, would likely be at the forefront of such a movement. Does this sound improbable? Consider that just last year, Several Oregon counties openly explored the possibility of realignment, indicating that these discussions are not merely hypothetical. The border might be a legal construct, but the bond between Oregon and Canada is cultural, economic, and emotional. They share not just trade routes, but a similar outlook on environmental stewardship and social progressivism. So, we must pose the question, is Oregon already halfway to becoming a part of Canada, not just geographically, but ideologically and culturally? Now, let's turn our attention to the Golden State, California. The beaches, the tech industry, the Hollywood glamour. You might think you have this state figured out. But what if California's commitment to the United States isn't as steadfast as it appears? California boasts the world's fifth largest economy standing alone. This isn't just a state, it's an economic titan. We're still discussing a single U.S. state, yet its global influence is undeniable. Here lies the twist. This sun-drenched, sprawling giant might already be operating by its own set of rules that often align more closely with international partners than with federal directives. And Canada? It's been observing closely. You'd be taken aback by the depth of the connections. Over $44 billion in annual trade links California and Canada, encompassing not just goods, but also climate policies, cultural exchanges, and cooperative initiatives. California has proactively signed independent environmental agreements with Canadian provinces like British Columbia and Quebec. Notice the distinction. These are state-to-province accords, bypassing federal channels entirely. When California encounters resistance from Washington, D.C. on policy matters, who does it often turn to next? Ottawa. Consider this alignment. Both British Columbia and California have enacted ambitious carbon reduction laws, championed healthcare reforms, and invested heavily in green technology initiatives. They don't just share similar thoughts, they implement parallel plans. In fact, back in 2018, California's governor at the time was described by a Canadian minister as being more Canadian than some Canadians. This isn't mere flattery, it could be foreshadowing. Furthermore, the cultural exchange is vibrant. In areas of Northern California, Canadian brands and tourists integrate seamlessly. Canadians own property, invest, and even work remotely within the state. The distinction between neighbor and partner is becoming increasingly blurred. If the U.S. were to face significant internal shifts, do you genuinely believe California wouldn't weigh its options? Could the Golden State consider swapping stars for a maple leaf? Perhaps not immediately, but one must ask, is it already substantially oriented in that direction? Let's travel east to Vermont. It's tranquil, verdant, almost excessively peaceful. Yet beneath the charm of covered bridges and picturesque mountain towns, an unexpected undercurrent is stirring. Vermont might just be the most Canadian state within the U.S., and it extends far beyond a shared love for maple syrup. Here's a piece of history you probably didn't know. Vermont once seriously considered joining Canada. Yes, truly. During the 1860s, there were open discussions about annexation. While that historical moment passed, fast forward to the present day, and the idea doesn't seem quite so outlandish anymore. Culturally, Vermont reflects Quebec's progressive values and Nova Scotia's intimate small-town warmth. Its population, just over 640,000, is smaller than most major Canadian cities, fostering a similar sense of close-knit community. In recent elections, nearly 70% of Vermonters voted for policies aligning more closely with Ottawa than with Washington, D.C. And then there's the matter of healthcare. Vermont made a bold attempt to implement a single-payer system. Sound familiar? That's essentially Canada's hallmark healthcare model. Although the specific plan didn't materialize, largely due to the challenges of a small state implementing such a large-scale system independently, the aspiration itself speaks volumes about the state's ideological leanings. The desire was there, reflecting a fundamental alignment with Canadian principles. Even economically, Vermont fits the Canadian mold with its emphasis on small-scale agriculture, clean energy initiatives, and sustainable forestry. It practically operates like a province in disguise. And let's not overlook geography. Montreal is nearer to Vermont's capital, Montpellier, than Boston is. Cross the border, and you encounter bilingual signage, amiable customs officials, and a rhythm of life that feels strangely familiar. So, one has to wonder, if Vermont already walks, talks, and votes in ways remarkably similar to its northern neighbor, what's truly keeping it anchored solely within the U.S.? Continuing our exploration in New England, we arrive at Massachusetts. They say the American Revolution ignited here. The tea, the protests, the revolutionary fire. Over 2 centuries later, Massachusetts might be subtly positioned on the brink of another quiet transformation, and this time, its gaze seems directed northward. You might be surprised by how much this historically significant state aligns with Canadian ideals in the year 2025. First, consider the policies. Universal health care, a cornerstone of Canadian society. Massachusetts came remarkably close, leading the U.S. in health coverage with over 97% of its residents insured, thanks to its own state-level system, implemented long before the Affordable Care Act even existed. This pioneering approach mirrors Canadian healthcare principles. How about education? Massachusetts consistently ranks #1 in the U.S. for its public school system, often rivaling the high standards of provinces like Ontario. In fact, Canadian education experts frequently study Massachusetts as a benchmark for educational excellence. But the parallels don't end at schools or hospitals. The state has aggressively pursued climate action, promoted clean energy, and championed social equity, initiatives directly in line with Canada's national objectives. And let's not forget proximity. Driving from Boston to Montreal takes less than 5 hours. Crossing the border often feels less like entering a foreign country and more like visiting a cultural cousin. Tourism flows freely, Canadian businesses have a significant presence, and shared values are evident. A 2023 study even indicated that cities in Massachusetts scored higher on Canadian value indicators than some regions within Canada itself. That's not just surprising, it's historically significant. There are even quiet, intellectual discussions suggesting that in the face of future global shifts, the entire New England bloc could evolve into an even closer partnership with Canada. Not conspiracy, but potential strategy. So here's the question. If a state's values, policies, and even its people align so closely with Canada, how fundamentally American does it remain? Now, let's head to the Midwest and consider Michigan. You cross a single bridge, and suddenly the accent subtly changes. Welcome to Michigan, the state with a literal handshake connection to Canada across the Detroit River. But here's something many might not realize. That handshake, that connection, has been strengthening significantly. Michigan shares an astonishing 721 miles of border with Canada, more than almost any other state. Detroit and Windsor aren't just neighboring cities. They function practically as twin cities, separated merely by a river and the need for a passport. Over $70 billion in trade traverses this border annually, making it one of the most vital economic corridors between the U.S. and Canada. But the bond extends far beyond monetary exchange. This is a state known for manufacturing, and so is Ontario. Auto manufacturing, a shared cornerstone. Steel and technology, deeply integrated supply chains. Even joint emergency response teams exist between the two countries specifically for the Great Lakes region. You'd be amazed at how synchronized their operational systems have become. Let's talk values. Michigan voters recently passed protections for abortion access, legalized recreational marijuana, and invested billions in clean energy. All policy decisions mirroring Canada's federal trajectory within the last 5 years. Does that sound familiar? It's nearly lockstep. Furthermore, a 2024 regional values survey found that 52% of Michiganders expressed a preference for Canadian-style healthcare over the current U.S. system. That's not a subtle preference. It's a seismic indicator. And don't forget identity. Residents of Michigan's Upper Peninsula often jest about feeling disconnected from the rest of the country. But ask them about Canada, and you'll hear tales of weekend excursions to Thunder Bay, fishing trips with relatives across the border, or purchasing more affordable medications from Ontario pharmacies. This isn't just being neighborly, it's personal. So what happens if political or economic landscapes shift significantly in America again? What occurs when people start looking north not just as visitors, but perhaps as potential future citizens? Finally, let's touch upon New York, Connecticut, and Montana before drawing our conclusions. We all recognize the New York brand: skyscrapers, Wall Street, the dazzling lights. Yes, we know the image. But beneath the skyline and the relentless energy, New York possesses another dimension, one rarely seen on television, that is quietly edging closer to Canada than most people comprehend. Here's a headline you might not have anticipated. New York conducts more trade with Canada than with any other single foreign nation, exceeding $35 billion annually. This isn't sporadic commerce, it's a vital economic artery. With over 500 miles of shared border, including 4 major land crossings and the iconic Peace Bridge near Buffalo, this relationship isn't just neighborly, it's structurally ingrained. In places like Buffalo and Plattsburgh, Canadian businesses own significant assets: factories, real estate, and crucial supply chain links. Niagara Falls represents practically shared territory, and with Toronto just a short drive away, some New Yorkers spend more weekends north of the border than downstate. But where things truly intertwine is in values. In 2023, New York enacted one of the most ambitious climate action laws in the U.S., mirroring, almost verbatim, sections of Canada's federal framework. Social programs are expanding, the minimum wage is rising, and public transit systems are growing, echoing models seen in Montreal and Vancouver. These aren't mere coincidences. They represent convergence. Even culturally, the lines blur. Upstate New York towns host dual citizenship festivals, and countless residents have family ties directly across the border. Language, media consumption, fashion trends, even allegiances to hockey teams often blend in these borderland regions. A 2022 study revealed that 1 in 6 upstate New Yorkers identified more strongly with Canadian values than with those prevalent in southern U.S. states. Connecticut, though small and often overshadowed, presents its own compelling case. It's polished, subtle, almost hidden on a map dominated by larger states and bolder headlines. But Connecticut isn't merely sipping lattes and managing hedge funds. It's quietly aligning itself with something unexpected, and that something might just favor a maple leaf. Economically, it's a powerhouse in insurance, biotechnology, and green tech, industries already fostering strong partnerships with Ontario and Quebec. In 2024 alone, Connecticut's trade with Canada surpassed $3.2 billion, and this figure is steadily increasing. The state also maintains some of the highest education standards in the U.S., frequently ranked alongside, not beneath, Canadian provinces in literacy and academic achievement metrics. You'll find shared academic research projects connecting Yale University with prominent Canadian institutions. There's even a noticeable influx of Canadian retirees opting for quiet Connecticut towns as second homes, attracted by the climate, accessible health care, and the general pace of life. The values here often run parallel to those north of the border. It's not just policy, it's culture. What makes Connecticut particularly intriguing is its adaptability, its capacity to blend seamlessly into different systems. If political climates shift, if economic alliances recalibrate, if identity itself becomes a point of discussion, Connecticut could pivot quietly and smoothly, not out of rebellion, but out of readiness. And then there's Montana. Rugged, vast, untamed. Beyond the breathtaking mountains and expansive landscapes, Montana is cultivating one of the most intriguing cross-border relationships in North America, largely unnoticed by the rest of the country. Montana doesn't just share a border with Canada, it often feels intrinsically linked to it. With over 540 miles of shared boundary, this state boasts more direct crossings with Canada than almost any other. In many remote areas, towns on either side depend more on each other than on their distant respective capitals. You'd be surprised how often border residents casually mention popping over to Alberta for various needs. It's not just locals either. Montana engages in billions of dollars of trade with Canada annually, particularly in energy, lumber, and agriculture. Some regions rely heavily on Canadian infrastructure for essential power and water flow. In fact, cross-border emergency services are already coordinated. This isn't theory, it's practical reality. Even the economy shows alignment. Canada's appreciation for natural resources and environmental balance perfectly matches Montana's identity. Culturally, The shared values of hunting, fishing, ranching, and self-reliance are undeniable. These aren't just neighbors, they're reflections of each other. In a 2024 regional value poll, over 60% of Montanans favored local governance over federal oversight, and nearly 1 in 5 felt a stronger connection to Alberta than to the U.S. East Coast. That's significant. Imagine living in a town closer to Calgary than to your own state capital. Your daily existence flows through Canadian routes. Goods are priced in both currencies, and your values align more closely with a province across the border than a city across the country. At what point does that administrative line become less relevant than the lived reality? So, here we stand, having examined 10 U.S. states that might be nearer to Canada than anyone initially perceived. From the rainy Pacific Northwest to the rugged terrain of Montana, from the polished charm of New England to the economic bridges spanning the Great Lakes, one thing is undeniably clear. Borders are not merely lines on a map. They represent ideas, economies, cultures, and values. And some of those ideas, those connections, are undergoing a profound shift. Perhaps it's driven by trade, maybe by cultural affinity, or possibly by the quiet gravitational pull of shared values in an increasingly complex world. Whatever the underlying reasons, the question persists. If these states already think like Canada, work closely with Canada, and in many ways, live like Canada, then what truly defines their American identity? What keeps them anchored solely to the south when so much pulls them north? The journey of exploration isn't finished, and neither are the stories unfolding along this dynamic border. Thank you for joining us on this exploration.